Back in 1942, in the freezing cold of Buffalo, New York, our factories were running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. The men and women on those assembly lines, your parents and grandparents perhaps, were building a fighter plane that was supposed to be a world beater. It looked like something from the future. But when the test pilots, the brave men who had to fly it, walked up to this gleaming new machine, they'd stop. They'd look at the logbook, look at the aircraft, and simply shake their heads. "I'm not flying that," one pilot said, his words echoing across the hangar. "Not that Deathtrap." They called it the flying Coffin. This was the Bell P-39 Airacobra, and on paper, it was a revolution. While every other fighter in the world, the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt, the Zero, was built around a heavy engine bolted to the nose, the P-39 was different. The designers at Bell Aircraft did something brilliant. They took the massive Allison V-12 engine and placed it behind the pilot, right at the plane's center of gravity. This wasn't just a gimmick. This one decision solved 2 of the biggest problems in fighter design. First, it gave the aircraft near-perfect weight distribution, making it theoretically one of the most agile fighters in the sky. Second, and this is the important part, it left the entire nose of the aircraft empty. And what do you put in an empty nose? You put the biggest cannon anyone had ever dared to mount on a single-engine fighter. This was the 37mm T9 cannon, a weapon so large the plane was essentially designed around it. The barrel of that cannon ran right through the propeller hub, aimed straight at the enemy. While other fighters were chipping away with rifle-caliber machine guns, the P-39 was built to deliver a single, devastating punch. One hit from this cannon could vaporize a German bomber's engine or tear the wing clean off a Messerschmitt. This, combined with the first tricycle landing gear ever put on a frontline fighter, made the P-39 seem like an unassailable leap forward. It was the future of air combat. So why then were America's best pilots refusing to fly it? Why was it gathering dust in fields across the country while a war was raging? The problem was that the P-39 wasn't just a revolution. It was a failure, a catastrophic, deadly failure. That brilliant mid-engine design created a nightmare for the men in the cockpit. To get the power from the engine behind the pilot to the propeller in front of him, Bell's engineers had to run a 10-foot-long drive shaft directly under the pilot's seat. This wasn't some simple piece of steel. It was a complex, high-speed shaft that connected the engine to a gearbox, and it was notoriously unreliable. Pilots who did fly it described the experience with dread. They said it was like sitting on top of a washing machine full of bolts during the spin cycle. The entire airframe was racked with a deep, bone-jarring vibration that made precision gunnery almost impossible. The noise in the cockpit was deafening, but the vibration wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the fear. In a normal fighter, like a P-40 Warhawk, your engine was in front of you. If it caught fire or threw a rod, you saw the smoke, you saw the oil. You had a few precious seconds to react. In the P-39, the engine, the oil, and the fuel lines were all directly at your back. Pilots knew that if anything went wrong, they wouldn't get a warning. The first sign of trouble would be fire licking at the back of their neck, and then there was the drive shaft itself. Every pilot who climbed into that cockpit had the same horrifying thought. If that shaft failed, if it broke free at 3,000 RPM, it would shred through the cockpit floor and the pilot sitting on top of it. But even this wasn't the flaw that earned it the name Flying Coffin. The P-39 had a much more fundamental, much more fatal secret. The American and British Air Forces had a very specific idea of what a fighter was supposed to do. It was supposed to climb high, very high, to protect heavy bombers. The air war over Europe was a high-altitude war, fought in the thin, cold air above 25 or even 30,000 feet. And up there, the Bell P-39 Airacobra couldn't breathe. The Allison V-1710 engine, so powerful on the ground, was missing one critical component: an effective 2-stage supercharger. A supercharger is essentially a compressor that forces more air into the engine, allowing it to maintain power as the atmosphere gets thinner. Without it, the P-39 was magnificent at sea level, but as it climbed, its power vanished. Above 12,000 feet, pilots reported the plane felt heavy and sluggish. By 15,000 feet, it was, in their words, a sitting duck. A German Messerschmitt Bf-109 could cruise comfortably thousands of feet above it, choosing exactly when and where to dive down and attack with total impunity. The P-39 wasn't just a bad fighter. It was a fighter that simply could not perform its one intended mission. It was an interceptor that couldn't intercept. The British, who had been desperate for any plane they could get, tested the Airacobra and immediately canceled their massive order. They found it dangerous, underpowered, and completely unsuited for the war they were fighting. In early 1942, USAF test pilots and evaluators, including reports from the Army Air Force's Materiel Command, deemed the plane unsuitable for American combat use after flight tests revealed its limitations. They stated, "The aircraft is fundamentally unsuited for the high-altitude interception role. Its rate of climb is poor. Its handling characteristics at altitude are dangerous. It cannot be recommended for combat operations against the Luftwaffe." This was it. The verdict was in. The P-39 was a failure. A rational system would have canceled the program right then. The Bell factories in Buffalo would have been retooled to build something that worked, like the P-47 Thunderbolt or the P-51 Mustang. But war is not rational. The year was 1942. The United States was still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. The Philippines were falling. German U-boats were sinking ships just off the coast of Florida. We weren't winning the war. We were desperately trying not to lose it. And the factories in Buffalo were already running. They were magnificent. Thousands of men and women working around the clock had perfected the art of building P-39s. They were rolling off the assembly line by the hundreds. Stopping that line would mean sending everyone home, tearing down the tooling, and starting from scratch. It was a delay America simply could not afford. The time lost would be measured in months, maybe even a year. So, the assembly lines kept running. The workers in Buffalo, with grim determination, kept building brand new fighters that their own pilots refused to fly. These planes were rolling off the line, being pushed out into the snow and parked. Hundreds, then thousands, of shiny, advanced, and utterly useless fighters sat in storage fields across the country, gathering dust. It was one of the biggest embarrassments of the American war effort, a strategic disaster that cost millions of dollars and, more importantly, precious time. The P-39 was a plane with no mission and no pilot. And then an unexpected solution came from the one place on Earth that was even more desperate than America. The Soviet Union was on its knees. In 1942, the German war machine was deep inside Russia, pushing toward Stalingrad. The Soviet Air Force had been decimated in the opening days of the invasion. Their primary fighters, like the LAG-3, were often made of wood and were hopelessly outclassed. Soviet pilots were being sent up to fight in planes they nicknamed the Varnished Guaranteed Coffin. They were dying by the thousands. Joseph Stalin, through diplomatic channels, was making it clear he needed aircraft, he needed tanks, he needed anything America could send, and he needed it now. Through the Lend-Lease program, America was already shipping massive amounts of supplies. And as Washington officials looked at the mounting piles of unwanted P-39s, a cynical but practical idea formed. Why not send these? The thinking was simple, if not a little cold. We couldn't use them, our pilots hated them, but the Russians were desperate. Let's send them the Airacobras, fulfill our Lend-Lease obligation, and keep the good planes, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts, for our own boys. It was, in essence, a way to dispose of an embarrassing mistake. So the great journey began. The P-39s were loaded onto cargo ships, surviving the treacherous U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. They were sailed to ports in the Persian Gulf, then painstakingly disassembled, loaded onto trucks, and driven overland through the mountains of Iran into southern Russia. It was a brutal, month-long journey. Many planes were damaged, some were lost. But by late 1942, the first of these rejected American fighters began arriving at Soviet air bases. And the moment they got there, something happened that nobody in Washington or London could have ever predicted. The Soviet pilots didn't just like the Airacobra, they loved it. They approached the American machine with no preconceptions. They didn't care about high-altitude performance. Why? Because the air war on the Eastern Front was a completely different war. It wasn't a strategic chess match fought at 30,000 feet. It was a chaotic, brutal, muddy brawl fought at treetop height. The German Stuka dive bombers were attacking Soviet trenches from just a few thousand feet. The Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes were skimming the ground, hunting tanks. The swirling, desperate dogfights that decided the fate of battles were happening in the thick, heavy air below 10,000 feet. And in that environment, every single one of the P-39's flaws suddenly became a game-changing strength. That Allison engine, the one that choked and wheezed in the thin air above 12,000 feet, down low, it was a powerhouse. It was reliable, responsive, and gave the P-39 blistering acceleration, making it faster and more maneuverable than the German Bf-109 at those low altitudes. That tricycle landing gear, which American pilots thought was just a needless complication, for Soviet pilots operating from hastily built, muddy, snow-covered airfields, it was a miracle. While German 109s with their narrow, conventional landing gear were constantly tipping over and getting stuck, the P-39 could take off and land from almost anywhere. And that 37-millimeter cannon? To the Soviet pilots, it was a gift from heaven. They had been trying to shoot down heavily armored German bombers with tiny machine guns. Now they had a weapon that could destroy a Junker Ju-88 with a single, well-placed shot. The entire tail section would simply disintegrate. But there was another feature, one that American pilots had complained about: the radio. The P-39 came equipped with a high-quality, reliable radio set. At the time, many Soviet fighters either had no radio at all or had ones that barely worked. This meant Soviet pilots were fighting as individuals, unable to coordinate. The P-39 allowed them for the first time to fight as a team. A flight leader could see a threat and instantly direct his wingman. This one piece of technology revolutionized their tactics. This is a great moment to pause and think about how often in life a tool is called useless simply because it's being used for the wrong job. We hear stories like this all the time, and the P-39 is perhaps the greatest example in military history. If you enjoy these kinds of deep dives that uncover the real story, this is what we do every week. Taking a moment to subscribe to the channel ensures you won't miss the next one, and it's the single best way to support our work. It truly makes all the research worthwhile. The P-39 wasn't a high-altitude interceptor. It was a low-altitude predator. And in the skies of the Eastern Front, it had finally come home. Senior Lieutenant Grigory Rekalov, one of the first to fly it in combat, wrote in his report, "The American machine is heavy, but solid. It does not climb well, but it dives like a stone. The cannon is magnificent. Today, I destroyed a Junker 88 with 3 shells. This aircraft rewards aggression." That last line became the new doctrine. The P-39 was an instrument of aggression. Soviet pilots learned to use its strengths. They would use their radios to find the enemy, dive down from a slightly higher altitude, build up tremendous speed, close to point-blank range, fire a single, devastating burst from the cannon, and then use their momentum to climb away before the stunned German pilots could even react. In the hands of men who understood its purpose, the flying Coffin was becoming one of the most lethal weapons of the war. But it would take one pilot in particular to turn it from a good plane into a legend. His name was Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin. Pokryshkin was not a typical pilot. He was a thinker, a natural-born tactician. He had started the war flying obsolete biplanes, and he had survived the German onslaught in 1941 by being smarter and more ruthless than his enemies. He was deeply frustrated with the old, rigid Soviet tactics that sent pilots to their deaths in predictable formations. When Pokryshkin first laid eyes on the P-39 in early 1943, he didn't see a flawed American import. He saw the perfect tool. He saw a sturdy airframe, a powerful engine for low-altitude work, and that magnificent cannon. He immediately sat down and developed an entirely new tactical system, a formula for air combat, as he called it, designed specifically around the Airacobra's strengths. His formula was simple: altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. His squadron would patrol at a medium altitude, around 15,000 feet, always staying above the main chaos of the battlefield, but below the P-39's danger zone. From there, they would watch and wait, using their superior radios to coordinate. When they spotted a formation of German bombers or fighters below them, the attack would be instant and precise. Pokryshkin would lead his flight in a steep, high-speed dive. They wouldn't engage in a swirling, turning dogfight. That was what the Germans expected. Instead, they would use their speed to slash through the enemy formation, each pilot picking a target, closing to point-blank range, and firing a single, accurate burst from the 37mm cannon. Then, before the enemy escort fighters could react, they would use their retained energy to zoom climb back up to safety, reset, and do it all over again. It was devastatingly effective. German pilots, used to outclassing the early Soviet planes, were now being shot out of the sky by an enemy they never even saw. Pokryshkin's personal score began to climb at an astonishing rate. 5 kills, 10, 20. By the summer of 1943, he was already one of the Soviet Union's leading aces, and his entire regiment, flying nothing but American-built Airacobras, was one of the most feared units on the entire front. It got to the point where German radio operators, listening in on Soviet transmissions, began to recognize his voice and his call sign. A new warning began to spread across the German airwaves, a cry of genuine fear. Achtung! Achtung! Pokryshkin! Attention! Pokryshkin is in the air. Think about that. The pilot of the worst American fighter had become the #1 bogeyman of the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front. The ultimate test came in July 1943 at the Battle of Kursk. This was the largest tank battle in human history, a desperate final gamble by Germany to regain the initiative in the East. Thousands of tanks and hundreds of thousands of men clashed in a brutal struggle. The Luftwaffe committed its very best units, expecting to sweep the skies clear and allow their Stuka dive bombers to pound the Soviet tanks into submission. They were counting on air superiority. What they found instead was Alexander Pokryshkin and his regiment of P-39s. In the skies over Kursk, Pokryshkin's tactics were put to the ultimate test, and they worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. His regiment tore into the German bomber formations. The Stukas, slow and vulnerable, were massacred. In just the first week of the battle, Pokryshkin's unit claimed over 100 German aircraft destroyed. His personal tally for that month alone was 23 confirmed kills. The German offensive, which had been so dependent on air support, faltered. Their tanks, exposed from above, were hammered by the Soviet Air Force. The P-39 Airacobra, the plane American pilots had laughed at, was playing a decisive role in turning the tide of the entire war. By mid-1943, reports of this incredible success began filtering back to a very confused intelligence community in Washington. The initial reaction was disbelief. How could this be? How could the flying Coffin be the star of the Eastern Front? Some analysts dismissed it as Soviet propaganda. They assumed the Russians were just being polite, trying to make their American allies feel good about sending them second-rate equipment. But the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. The Soviet Union, through its official Lend-Lease requests, was now specifically asking for more P-39s. They weren't asking for the new P-51 Mustang. They weren't asking for the tough P-47 Thunderbolt. They were demanding every single P-39 Airacobra that Bell could build. In the end, of the 9,584 Airacobras built in Buffalo, nearly 5,000 of them, more than half, were sent directly to the Soviet Union. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the American and British assessment was, in fact, completely correct. The P-39 was a terrible, high-altitude fighter. It was unsuited for bomber escort. But the Soviet assessment was also correct. It just so happened that their doctrine, low altitude, tactical air support, and ground attack, was the one mission the P-39 was, by sheer accident, perfectly built for. The same characteristics that made it a failure in one war made it a legend in another. And back in the United States, the engineers at Bell Aircraft, who had endured the humiliation of their design being rejected, were now looking at these reports from Russia with intense interest. They were absorbing the lessons. The P-39's failures had taught them what not to do, but its successes had proven that some of their radical ideas were, in fact, brilliant. That tricycle landing gear? It was revolutionary. It was safer, provided better visibility on the ground, and was far easier for new pilots to handle than the old tail-dragger planes. After the P-39, virtually every new American aircraft, from fighters to bombers, would adopt tricycle landing gear. The car door-style cockpit, while awkward, was part of a design that prioritized pilot visibility. This, too, became a central pillar of future fighter design, leading directly to the bubble canopy on planes like the Mustang. Even the mid-engine concept, the source of so many problems, had proven a point. It showed that unconventional layouts could offer huge advantages in firepower and balance. Bell tried to build an improved version, the P-63 King Cobra. It was bigger, more powerful, and fixed many of the P-39's flaws. But by the time it was ready, America was already invested in the P-51 and P-47. So, where did the P-63 go? You guessed it. Almost all of them were shipped directly to the Soviet Union, where they served with distinction. But the P-39's real legacy wasn't the P-63. Its real legacy was the jet age. In 1943, at Lockheed's Skunk Works, a brilliant designer named Clarence Kelly Johnson began sketching America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. When that plane emerged, it looked surprisingly familiar. Like the P-39, its engine was behind the pilot. Like the P-39, it had tricycle landing gear for safe handling on runways. And like the P-39, it was designed to give the pilot maximum possible visibility. The P-80 was everything the P-39 had tried to be. It took the innovative concepts that Bell had pioneered and, by mating them with a new jet engine, eliminated the flaws. The P-39 was the evolutionary bridge. It was the failure that taught American engineers the critical lessons they needed to dominate the skies for the next 50 years. The plane's high-altitude failure forced America to master supercharging, leading to the high-flying Mustang. Its low-altitude success in Russia proved that a plane must be built for a specific mission. And its radical design, from the landing gear to the cannon, set the template for the jet fighters that would soon follow. When the war in Europe ended, Alexander Pokryshkin landed his P-39 for the last time. He had been awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, the highest honor his nation could bestow. He ended the war with 59 confirmed victories, almost all of them achieved while flying the Bell P-39 Airacobra. This made him the second highest scoring Allied ace of the entire war. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote about the American plane with genuine affection. "The American machine," he said, "taught me everything important about air combat. It rewarded skill and punished mistakes. It gave me the tools to survive and the weapons to destroy my enemies. The factory workers in Buffalo, who had spent years riveting together planes they were told were death traps, probably never knew the full story. They couldn't have known that on the other side of the world, their failed product was helping turn the tide of the largest land war in history. Today, the few surviving P-39s sit quietly in museums. The placards next to them often use dismissive language, calling the plane an unsuccessful design that found a niche in Soviet service. But that assessment, while technically true, misses the entire point of the story. The P-39 challenges the simple idea that a machine is either a success or a failure. It proves that context is everything. It shows that the same piece of technology can be both a flying coffin and an ace maker, separated only by how and where it is used. The failure that should have been canceled ended up teaching lessons that built the future. The plane everyone laughed at taught American designers how to build the F-86 Sabre that would fight in Korea. Its flaws exposed our weaknesses, and its unexpected success showed us a new way forward. Sometimes the machines we reject are the ones that teach us the most. And sometimes America's worst fighter is the one that truly changes everything.